Well, good morning. Turn, if you would, please, to Job chapter 12. I thought last week I wanted to take a Sunday school lesson and just kind of talk to you pastorally, and I will explain really what, in my mind, I mean by that in just a second, about our current situation with COVID and the world in which we live. And it was really my intention to do it one time and be done, but after a number of conversations last week, I wanted to return to it once again and again speak pastorally. And what I mean by that is that I don't know that it would be I would, and I have counseled, people have asked what I've thought and I have given my opinion, but I don't know that I could speak definitively enough on the basis of biblical authority to suggest to you with anything like a Mount Sinai certainty that everybody ought to take the same position and the same response. There are things that are biblical absolutes that should govern the way we do respond to what is going on. And so I'm more concerned with that than trying to tell you what to do in light of that. So I want to read just a short passage from Job, simply because it is indicative of the world in which we live. My son sent it, he didn't write Job, but he sent me a text with these verses this week, kind of to describe the world in which we live. And that's part of the dilemma, is the world in which we're living. And then a verse that I think should govern the way we react not only to this, but to all things, and we will get to that. So let's pray, and then we'll look at these passages. Our Heavenly Father, I pray that you would grant to us wisdom, that we would know what the right thing to do is, that we would honor you, that when the time of our judgment comes, and not just with reference to this situation, but all situations, when the time of our judgment comes, that we can honestly, accurately, clearly explain that we believed we were honoring you in all the decisions that we made. And so pray that you'd help us to that end. In Jesus' name, amen. Job chapter 12, verse number 23. He increaseth the nations and destroyeth them. He enlargeth the nations and straighteneth them again, which means constrains is what the word straighten means. So he makes them, right? So, right, he makes them grow and he crushes them down. He makes them big and then he makes them small. Verse number 24, he taketh away the heart of the chief of the people of the earth and causeth them to wander in a wilderness where there is no way. They grope in the dark without light, and he maketh them to stagger like a drunken man. We're certainly watching our elected officials conduct themselves like that in a variety of arenas, it appears. And that is, there is no doubt, folks, there should be no doubt that we are living in the midst of God's deliberate hand of activity. And so there's one dimension. Psalm 51. Psalm 51, of course, is David's poem that he wrote after his sin with Bathsheba and his subsequent public address. Verse number 6 is the passage, the verse that I wish to call our attention to. Behold, thou desirest truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Truth in the inward parts. This is the great quest for us, folks. That what we say and do outwardly and the way we respond externally is genuinely something that would be true inwardly, since the Lord's judgment of us is not simply a judgment on what we do, but a judgment based in what he knows about what we do. And that is the part that makes it somewhat daunting. So let me just begin, and I wrote this in my notes, just on the off chance that in 200 years somebody would stumble across this Sunday school lesson and wonder what it was about. A very brief recapitulation of where we are. In March 2020, the world began an in-earnest response to the COVID-19 virus. Schools ended their school year early. We did that as well. Public meetings and gatherings were restricted. Quarantines were imposed. And of course, all the details can be found in all the multitude of web articles and newspaper headlines. There immediately then followed a series of both governmental restrictions, guided in part by CDC guidelines. And yet the governmental responses, it is inescapable, at least it seems to me, in my opinion, had a distinctly partisan air. The more left a government, a state tended to lean, the more harsh and restrictive tended to be their measures, regardless of the success of those measures, which I'm not even going to try and tackle. Right? I think that we all looked at this and recognized that I have a couple of pastor friends who live in blue states, and we, of course, live in pretty much a red state, and there's a marked and noticeable difference in the way our state governments responded to COVID in all kinds of things. So I would argue that the response of government was a reflection of their worldview. Right? I mean, part and parcel of the left mentality is that government should and has the ability and the resources and the wherewithal to come to the rescue in any crisis. That's just how that party tends to think. Historically, we should recognize that they are responding. Right? We live in a world, folks, in which those governed by the consent of the governed, and it's probably time that we in conservative circles and even uber-conservative circles like ours should recognize that we are outnumbered, that there are more people willing to be governed by those that are governing us than we would like to admit. But that's neither here nor there. So the collateral damage in all of that, of course, are individual liberties. And, we're still dealing with the fallout. And, of course, what followed was, in my estimation, kind of like college game day, which each side touted its successes and minimized its failures, while the other side did the same. Meanwhile, those of us who are among the peasantry are living with the ever-changing trajectory of the authorities. We're going to impose these kinds of quarantines until we flatten the curve, or as I like to think of it, the good old days. We're going to acknowledge 50 years of scientific theory that cloth masks are relatively useless, so they're not worth wearing. They're mandatory to all the things that go with that. Should be worn until there's a suitable vaccination. And those kind of mask mandates, folks, I think we all understand, came at us from a variety of sources. Not all of them. I mean, our city council imposed a mask mandate. There was government. But long before that, local businesses or nationwide businesses had imposed a variety of mask mandates. And I think we all kind of learned to navigate in that world, and some businesses. I went to the local grocery store last week, and they have a security guard standing at the door of the grocery store. Why he is there is absolutely lost on me. Big sign now, wear mask unless you're fully vaccinated. And I walk in without the mask. Number one, I am fully vaccinated. And number two, I just walked in without my mask, and he just looked at me and said hello. So I just was kind of trying to figure out where he fit into this grand scheme of thing. This is kind of the world where we live. December 14th, 2020, by the way, the first American received a COVID vaccination in New York, where the then Governor Mario Cuomo said, "This is the weapon that will end the war." And I believe this is the weapon that will end the war. Projections now are that 70% of us would need to be vaccinated in order to achieve herd immunity, or depending upon your perspective, tracking devices via injection. And as Google, and again, I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but as of August 13th, 2021, Google reported that 60.3% of Americans had received at least one dose of the vaccine, and 51.3% were fully vaccinated. And the plot thickens, whether that is a governmental plot or a satanic one, when the federal government and then many large companies followed by announcing that you had to have one as a condition of employment, which we are still sorting through. And when I say we, I don't just mean we at Westwood Heights Baptist Church. I mean we as America are still sorting through what does it look like to be on the mandate end of, if you want to keep your job, you have to be vaccinated. And I don't think any of us think that if we submitted to the vaccination, that would be the end of it. The push is already on for the booster, and will this become an annual event? And who knows, and who knows. Right, and the reality is, if you're not, and I'm not, one of those who are living with an employee mask mandate or vaccination mandate, the reality is that there is probably very little from stopping our Congress from imposing vaccination mandates or doing it in the way that they are inclined to do, folks, which is not so much as to say, here's a law that everybody has to have one, as here's a list of things you'll be denied if you do not. Right? It's kind of like the seatbelt laws. And I'm not equating a vaccination to a seatbelt law. I'm just saying that the federal government, there is no federal law that says you have to wear a seatbelt. What the federal government has said to the states is, if we don't have enough states that have seatbelt laws, then we're not going to give you federal highway dollars. You can fix your own roads. So you don't have to have a seatbelt law, but if you want federal money, you have to have a seatbelt law. Right? So, I'm not saying that it is, because you know me, folks. I'm not a conspiracy theory kind of guy. But you could just see this kind of thing going. No Social Security checks will be issued to people who don't have the vaccination. So, right? So none of us, my point is, none of us are immune to it. Some of us are looking at it from some lens of distance. Some of you are married to people who are living with that mandate. Some of you are employed under that mandate. But none of us are really immune from the fallout to that mandate. And depending upon the response, that it may become easier to refuse or more difficult to refuse, and we just don't know. So with that as the backdrop, right? With that is really kind of the backdrop. I just asked myself generically what the options are and how we might employ the Bible with reference to them. So very quickly, because I want to deal with two fairly quickly and then spend probably the bulk of the time on the third. All right. So option number one is just simply to get the vaccination. Right? Your employer says get the vaccination, and numbers of us got vaccinated without employee mandate or governmental mandate. We just felt like it was the thing to do and did it. Your employer told you to. You are not fundamentally opposed to vaccinations. You may not be a big fan of this one. You want to keep your job. You don't want to upend your life, and so you get the vaccination. Okay, so I'm not suggesting to you for a moment that is palatable, right? Again, I'm not sitting here qualified to make that decision on you. I just ask myself, biblically, as your pastor, is it unbiblical? If your employer says you got to get the vaccination if you want to keep your job, are you unbiblical if you say, okay, I will take the vaccination to get my job? And you could make the case that the Lord would protect you through the vaccine. That, right, the Lord's hand is not shortened to save by many or by few, that this could be something that the Lord would use, or we could submit to it in frustration, trusting that the Lord would spare us from any bad fallout. I've wondered this. I don't know what we would do, because we're Americans and individual liberties are part and parcel of what we are as a people. But if we lived in Paul's world, and the estimates are that somewhere between 25 to 40% of all the people who lived in Paul's world were slaves, this conversation would have a completely different flavor to it. If we weren't talking about employer-mandated vaccinations, but owner-mandated vaccinations, that would just alter the world. For the most part, our options would be only to trust that the Lord would protect us, either through the vaccine or from the vaccine. A Christian could view the vaccination as a providential blessing. And I realize that not many people view it that way, but it could be viewed that way. That modern medicine once again has, in record time, stepped into the gap to help us out medicinally. And it could be viewed that way. I'm fascinated at the contrast between the way Nehemiah and Ezra viewed the world in which they lived, which was the same world. When the king offered Nehemiah's soldiers, Nehemiah 2:9, I came to the governors beyond the river, gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and the horsemen with me. And Nehemiah just counted that a great blessing that he had Persian army at his side on this journey. So one option would be for us to take the vaccination and just take it. Another option is, of course, simply to refuse to take the vaccination. And to make the point that it is unconstitutional, which it probably is, to compel somebody to receive medical treatment against their will, although there is a heritage of the government forcing people to receive medical treatment against their will, like blood transfusions. It violates my civil rights. It is not fully proven. It has not been around long enough to know what the long-term side effects would be. It is none of your dadgum business whether or not I've been vaccinated. The question many of us have asked, whatever happened to my body, my choice? Is it only my choice when I want to kill an unborn baby? And we could go on and on, folks, but you get the point. Right? We could just take it. We could just take the vaccination. Or we could just refuse to take the vaccination. And we could refuse to take the vaccination and suffer whatever consequences there are. I'm not going to take it. You lose your job. Okay, I'm willing to lose my job over the vaccination. Cut and dried. I will forfeit my career for this. There has to be a line somewhere, and there does have to be a line somewhere. And for me, this is the line, and I'm absolutely not going to be vaccinated under edict or mandate. And you could argue equally that you trust the Lord to protect you in that, to provide for you, that you have taken a principled stand, one based upon your citizenship as an American and your liberties under the Constitution and your own individual rights to control what goes into your body. Whatever the argument would be, you could refuse the vaccination on that ground. And I'm going to make a distinguishing here between a Christian argument in just a moment. I'm talking about a principled, constitutional, individual right refusal to receive the vaccination. And again, as a pastor, I'm not sure that you would be wrong in taking that stand. I do think you could take that stand in a wrong way. I do think that you could be confrontational and belligerent and ugly about that stand, as unfortunately many are. And therefore, the stand is lost in the screeching rhetoric. But I think if your attitude in your refusal doesn't violate Scripture, I don't know pastorally that there would be any sin attached to going, this is a line I will not cross, this is a treatment I will not receive, and whatever the consequences are, I will suffer those consequences. And I have faith in my God to protect me and to provide for me. But again, I think that the biblical factor is the way that we would respond. We are obligated to pray for those that are in authority, even though they're evil. We are obligated to honor kings and those that rule over us, even though we do not respect them. Paul himself acknowledged the error of speaking evil of the ruler of his people. So again, to resort to what unfortunately happens all too often from the pulpits of Baptist churches, name-calling, belittling, that is not the proper response. Right? So I think that you could take a principled response of, I'm not going to do that. And that you could submit your rejection or your letter to the HR department or your immediate supervisor, whomever, and go, I just don't think that anybody has the right to tell me to do this, and I am willing to walk away from my job and its benefits in order to take that stand. And again, I don't know that there's anything wrong in doing that, as long as the way in which you do it is not biblical. I'm not even sure that participating in a peaceful protest is wrong, because we are Americans and we do have civil liberties and we do have the right to peaceably assemble, and those things are not forfeited by our Christianity. I'm not certain that there would be anything even wrong in participating in some kind of legal inquiry as to whether or not this can really be done, and there are a variety of opinions on that. Can your employer really require you to be vaccinated as a condition of employment? Don't know the answer to that. Don't know the answer to that. And you could, right? Because Nehemiah received assistance of the Persian army and went, look, I got Persian soldiers. And when the king offered Ezra Persian soldiers, he counted that a great affront to his faith and to the protective power of God. Ezra 8:22. For I was ashamed to require of the king a band of soldiers and horsemen to help us against the enemy on the way, because we had spoken unto the king, saying, the hand of our God is upon all them for good that seek him, but his power and his wrath is against all them that forsake him. So Nehemiah, the great believer, took the army and viewed it as a providential blessing of God, and Ezra refused to ask for an army, believing that it would be a gigantic chink in the defense he had made about the protective powers of God. So, what are your options? As again, I really don't, folks. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer to this. If we're all compelled to receive it, we could just take it. And we could recognize, folks, that being forced to take it puts us in the position of feeling like we're the victim of a crime, where the greatest loss is not the loss of property, but the loss of dignity. And all I would respond to that is that vengeance in that case belongs to the Lord. Right? He has a role in this. The third option is to, in some way, make the objection Christian. Right? So I could just take it. And I'm not saying there's not a Christian dimension to that. I'm just saying that I could just go, I'm just going to take it. Or I could say, I'm not going to take it, and nobody's going to make me take it. The third option is to go, I'm not going to take it because it would dishonor God to take it. And to me, again, speaking to you pastorally, that is a completely different issue. And you know, one of the things that is happening is that we are blending our constitutional rights and our Christian perspective together in this matter. And I'm not saying that that in and of itself is wrong. I'm just saying that I've got to be careful if I'm going to articulate an objection to it on the basis of Christianity, that I could defend that to the Lord. Look, folks, this is a monumental problem of humanity. not simply related to COVID and masks and vaccinations. I must be very, very careful always about turning something I don't want to do into something that God doesn't want me to do. And I've got to be very careful about turning something I want to do into something God wants me to do. And there are no shortage of conversations we have with ourselves and between each other over the course of things in which we make those kinds of statements. And I'm not saying that God doesn't. I'm just saying that we just need to recognize the case that sometimes we really, really just want to do something. And I would argue, again, pastorally, folks, that is part and parcel of being a human being. We are allowed to have desires. We are not allowed to give in to sinful desires. And that sometimes the most honest thing we can say is, I just want to do this. And there's nothing wrong in doing it. And so I'm going to do it. And we don't have to go, I want to do this and God really wants me to do this. Or in this case, the truth is, I really don't want to do it. And now, can I argue that God doesn't want me to do it? And again, I don't know that I can answer that for everybody because this becomes a matter of conscience in many ways. And the Bible doesn't insist that we all come to the same place in matters of conscience. It only insists that we all come to the same place, that we can answer our conscience in the Lord's presence truthfully. So I would argue, first of all, I just kind of want to walk through this, and again, as it seemed to flow to my little pea brain, and always, I'm not the last word. But I would argue that any request for a religious exemption, and that's kind of what's being cast about, or are there religious exemptions? I would argue that any request for a religious exemption would have to be sufficiently religious in nature that it would apply to any believer in any country. In other words, folks, it violates my constitutional rights, may be true, but it is not the Christian argument. Civil liberties is not the Christian argument. Because not all believers have civil liberties. All believers have the same Bible. So I would think that if we're going to argue it biblically, as an objection biblically, that we have to make sure we can make that argument existing as much as we can outside of government or cultural guidelines. Why is it wrong in the sight of God to receive the vaccination? What about receiving the vaccination could possibly offend the Lord? That's the question. And if I can't argue that clearly and sincerely, then it just seems to me that I don't really have a Christian objection. Why would the Lord be offended? All right, so one of the arguments that we could make, right? We could make the argument that we're not taking the vaccination because God is responsible for protecting me and I trust Him. Which is a great argument. But I think a very weak argument. Unless we apply that meticulously across the board. Our employers and our government do compel us to do many things for our own safety and for the sake of others. And we live with those constraints. And I understand. It's not the same thing as a vaccination, which is undoable and irreversible. But my point is simply this. Right? If I live under all of these governmental mandates, the government says, this is for your own good. This is for your own good. And I go, okay, I will submit because you say it's for my own good. And then I come here and the government says, this is for your own good. And I go, no, God is opposed to this. Where in that scenario did God become opposed to this in a way that He wasn't opposed to something else? That's all that's what I'm saying. I am not trying to make a decision on your behalf. I am, as your pastor, trying to map out some of the considerations that would go into that kind of argument. And I would point out furthermore, folks, although this is probably a separate issue, that frequently we like the government to involve in things in kind of these third-party scenarios. If you can't go to sleep at night on July 4th because at 3 o'clock in the morning or on July 10th because somebody is still blowing off all their leftover fireworks and it's 2 o'clock in the morning, do you go out and talk to them or do you get on the phone and call 911? See, lots of times we want the government to mediate when we're at odds with another human being. And all I'm saying is, right, I don't just get to go, okay, I will do this, I will do this, and I will do this, and I will do this, and I will do this. Right? Even though I don't necessarily buy into the viability of those things, but I will go along because they are laws, and then come here and go, wait a minute, now there's a line that God won't cross. Why won't God cross it? I know you don't want to cross it. I know that I may not want to cross it. But how can I argue that God is unwilling to cross it? At what point in time has it become about Him? So in other words, this is my concern as your pastor. Can you really stand and look the Lord in the eye and go, I wouldn't take the vaccination because it was to your glory, but I did wear my seatbelt. Or I did provide at least minimal car insurance. Or I did have health insurance. All of things are which we are mandated to do. So, secondly, right, we could make it about God by arguing that we don't want to dishonor Him by putting foreign substances into our body. Right? My body is the temple, and I'm not going to put a foreign substance into it. There are two considerations there. The first being this: have you put other foreign substances into your body? I mean, if I was the prosecuting attorney and somebody made that argument, I'm not taking the vaccination because my body is the temple and I don't put foreign substances into my body, I would just ask the question, have you ever put any other foreign substances into your body? Have you ever taken an antibiotic? If I was a nasty defense attorney, I'd ask this: have you ever taken a food supplement? This is a true story, by the way. This was a man only distantly connected to the church by virtue of a business relationship that we had with him, but he was actually an architect, and we'd worked with him a number of times. He had a daughter who was desperately ill. Desperately ill. This man, believe me, folks, this man is an absolute unbeliever. He is an unbeliever. He invited me one time to go to, it was like I don't know that it was a Kiwanis club, but he got invited to speak at one of these business luncheons. He said, hey, why don't you come? We had some business to discuss. I went to that thing. He got up and gave a 30-minute dirty story lecture. That was basically what he did. This man was in no way a believer. He's got a daughter, and she is, how's your daughter doing? We're not sure my daughter's going to survive. They can't figure out what's wrong with her. Then they finally did figure out what was wrong with her. She was overdosing on food supplements. She was killing herself with all the stuff that she was putting in her body. Do you put foreign substances in your body? Have you put other foreign substances in your body? Would you take an antibiotic? Would you take a prescription medication? But folks, that's not even really the issue, okay? Let me talk to you pastorally. Let me ask you if you would please to turn to Matthew chapter 15. My body is the temple, and I'm not going to defile my body by putting a foreign substance into it. Matthew 15:10. And he called the multitude and said unto them, hear and understand. Not that which goeth into the mouth defileth a man, but that which cometh out of the mouth, this defileth a man. Or Mark chapter 7 and verse number 18. Mark 7:18, he saith unto them, Are ye so without understanding also? Do ye not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into the man, it cannot defile him? Because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught. And depending upon the study version you have, or maybe you have even a different version other than our King James, purging all meats is not a commentary on the digestive process. Purging all meats is Mark's notation that in so making this statement, Jesus paved the way for Jews to eat pork. All meats are clean. Right? It is a very... Now look, I'm not arguing for a moment that this opens the door to making drunkenness acceptable, drug abuse acceptable, prescription drug abuse acceptable. I'm saying we just need to be very careful about making the defiling the temple argument when Jesus is pretty clear that when he's talking about defiling the temple, he wants to know where the heart is, not what's going on in the body. And that this was the big argument of the Jews, this external defilement factors. Now again, does that mean the vaccination is safe? I don't know how to answer that. Does that mean everybody should get it? I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm just saying that I don't think we have a solid foundation to go, well, it would defile the temple. Again, we ingest other things. And, right? Aspirin, ibuprofen, sweetener substitutes. We ingest other things. Looking for a benefit. Looking for relief. That's the only point that I'm trying to make. Or thirdly, right? So we could just, make the argument that we just want the Lord to take care of us and that this is not the issue. And again, I'm not saying a person shouldn't make that argument. I'm not saying that a person doesn't live it consistently. I'm just saying that whatever argument we're going to make, folks, we've got to endeavor to live that out completely consistently. Because that's what the Lord expects of us. Right? That's what the Lord really expects of us, that we live what we believe about Him to the fullest possible extent. We could argue that we're refusing the vaccination because of its association with abortion, which is probably the strongest possible case that we could make. Now, so before I go any further, I just want to make the disclaimer, which you all know, that I am not a scientist and do not possess scientific knowledge. And furthermore, I also recognize that no amount of sources are acceptable to a certain body of people. In other words, folks, we all know this. We have been flooded with a wave of medical professionals. You can watch them on all the major news networks telling you should get the vaccination, you should get the vaccination, you should get the vaccination. And there are just a certain body of people who go, yeah, they're all lying, they're not telling the truth. And there are X number of people out there, many of them physicians, medical experts, scientists going, don't take it, don't take it. There are going to be some people that believe that in spite of X number of people telling you to take it. There's always going to be anecdotal, and by that I mean, I know somebody that this happened to. There's always going to be that. So I realize that the things that I'm about to say are completely unreliable and unacceptable to some percentage of the people. All right, so I acknowledge that. Right? What possible connection could there be between the COVID-19 vaccination and abortion? So this is from the Nebraska Medical Center. right? And I'm just, if you know, I'm just going to read you the entire link, and then if you want to go back and get it, you can find it for yourself, right? NebraskaMed.com /COVID/you asked, we answered, do the COVID-19 vaccines contain aborted fetal cells? There's the link. Okay. Here in a nutshell is the condensed version of their very lengthy answer. COVID vaccines do not contain aborted fetal cells. Pfizer and Moderna did perform tests using fetal cell lines. Fetal cell lines are when they started with a cell from an aborted fetus. Many of those go back into the 1960s and 70s, but the research is ongoing today. And then that cell is kept alive and it duplicates, and they use the descendants of those cells for a variety of testing. Let me give you another website, and again, I'm just going to race through it here really quickly. historyofvaccines.org /content/articles /human cell strains vaccine development, and you can get into all of that kind of research and look at it. That website I thought had a very interesting history about the development of human cell strains, because we don't just use human cell strains, we use animal cell strains, and for a variety of reasons, and there's all kinds of technology that goes with that. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine does infect fetal cell lines with the adenovirus, which is the cause of the first common cold and also the first vaccination using human cells given to the American military, also known as the government's guinea pigs, in the 1960s. So there's the connection with abortion. Right? In the 1960s and the 1970s, in the 1960s, abortions were illegal. They've always been and always will be immoral. They were illegal in the 1960s. Some of those fetuses were donated to science. Scientists took those cells. They duplicated those cells. They keep them alive in whatever culture is necessary, and they use those cells for research. Over the course of time, right, those cells, right, they're kind of clones, and over the course of time, scientists are always hoping to get newer, fresher samples, which only adds to the horror and to the dilemma. So, all right. John Piper addressed this question, and I looked at Piper specifically because I just think that he is, he's brilliant and he handles these things pretty well. So again, this is desiringgod.org /interviews /can I take a vaccine made from aborted babies in January 2021. I won't read the entire article, but he made 4 points. Number one, on the basis of Romans 3:8, we should never do evil that good may come. Number two, we value Christ and his kingdom more than security or health. Number three, we testify to the sanctity of life. And number four, God blesses principled action in his name. I would add this. I would just ask this question. Here's the question that I ask, right? Is using a cloned line of cells descended from a baby taken in the 1960s or 70s sinful? Does that constitute a sin? I don't know the answer to that question. I got a phone call this week. I have two pastors friends. I mentioned they both live in Illinois. We all went to school together. We've maintained contact with each other now for almost 40 years. I kind of laugh at them. They both live in Illinois. They don't live terribly far apart from each other, but they are 1 trillion miles away in so many things. And my one pastor friend, you would have to kill him before you would get him to receive the COVID vaccination. He would die. He would die right here in the middle of the auditorium before he'd take it. It was the other one that called me this week, and he said, hey, what's going on? I said, man, I'm just kind of struggling with this as a pastor, trying to figure out what to tell people. I'm getting questions. What should I do? I'm going to have to get this vaccine. What should I do? What do you think that I ought to do? And I said, I'm just really struggling with it as a pastor. He said, you're kidding me. He said, I've been telling my people to get the vaccine since it was available. And I said, well, what about this cell line technology? What do you think about that? And he said, what do I think about that? He said, I was in the Navy. I was in the medical field in the Navy, and I have a degree in medical tech. Doctors, I have a degree in medical technology before I ever went to seminary. He said, there's probably not 100 people in the world that understand that technology. I tell my people to get the vaccine. And I go, I don't know. I don't know. What I do know is this, folks. Association does matter. I know that. Paul is very clear about that in 1 Corinthians 8. Association does matter. Right? This was the paradigm. This was the grid line that he gave us for solving some of these issues. Let's take something like meat, which has no moral attachment to it. Right? Jesus purged all meat. Romans 14, Paul said, Jesus himself taught me that nothing is unclean. So let's take this piece of meat, and now let's take it over to an idol's altar and offer it there, and let's bring it back and put it on the table, and let's make this amazing discovery. Through nothing to do with chemistry, nothing to do with physiology, nothing to change in the nature of the meat. The entire question is changed. You probably shouldn't eat it. So association does matter. So just to say that was 60 years ago or 70 years ago and it's a cloned cell and you are out of your mind for getting worked up about it, I think is a little simplistic. Because association does matter. So here are kind of the questions that you need to ask about that. Is that an association that you think God would be unpleased with? And again, remember folks, you're not receiving the cells. You're receiving a vaccination that was tested using the cells. Does that matter? And again, right? If you just don't want it, my counsel to you would be just say, I'm not going to get it. But don't try to make it about God if you can't really argue that it is about God to you. And if it is about God to you, again, as pastor, here's the counsel that I would give you. You have to use that mentality consistently. You can't just use it arbitrarily. You can't just use it here and not use it there. God wants truth in the inward parts. And Paul is pretty clear that consistency in this issue matters. We can't get into it and explore it all, but in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul was pretty clear that he made some adjustments to his lifestyle based upon the people that he was with. But he is equally clear, under the same inspiration of Scripture, that he had absolutely no use or toleration for what he called Peter's dissimulation in Galatians chapter 2. The difference, folks, was not external, it was internal. Peter and Paul were not inconsistent externally, they were inconsistent internally. That was the problem. So here's what I would say, right, to carry that on. If the association with abortion, because the testing was done on a fetal cell line that came from 1960, then I think you need to be consistent in that everywhere. Which would mean, number one, that you would have to reject the use of any current product that has used fetal cell line technology. And not all of them are medical. But this would require you to repudiate not only the COVID vaccination, but the rubella vaccination, the MMR. The rubella specifically was developed using fetal cell line testing. Some chickenpox and shingles vaccinations, some rheumatoid arthritis medications that are very effective in treating rheumatoid arthritis were developed using fetal cell line technology. hepatitis A vaccinations, if you should be required to have a hepatitis A vaccination. That was developed using fetal cell line technology. Right? If my argument, right? So the question in this case isn't the vaccination, it is the technology that made the vaccination even remotely possible. If I'm going to be opposed to the COVID vaccination because of its association with aborted fetuses, I've got to reject its association with aborted fetuses across the board. Yes, sir.
Can I make a statement?
Yes. But it depends. Are you going to hit me or something?
No. Kelly went to get a surgery. And when she went to take the surgery, they did a pregnancy test. They didn't do the proper pregnancy test. And they found out that the test was negative. She had the surgery. And she was pregnant. Afterwards, they found out she was pregnant. The doctor prescribed her a medication. When I went to the pharmacy to pick up this medication, the pharmacist said, "Don't take this if you're pregnant." I said, "My wife is pregnant." And they go, "Oh, well, if the doctor told you to take it, you should take it." A couple days later, the baby dies. There are doctors in this country that want to limit how many children we have. China is very open when it comes to limiting population. And this vaccine and this mandate is just trying to reduce our civil liberties and to prevent us from saying no to things that we are against. And there are a lot of doctors in the United States that want to limit how many babies that we have. And this is just one way of them to take away our liberties and just to have us accept what they want us to do.
Well, Dave, I think there are numbers of us that wouldn't fight with that. But again, that makes it a constitutional issue, not a Christian issue. And
Well, when King Herod went out and said, "I'm going to kill all the babies under 3," was that something we should object to? The Chinese people and all these doctors are trying to kill the babies before they're even born, or before they're even conceived. They're trying to.
well, I guess I don't know about that. No, well, obviously, right, let's just go to the biggest act of genocide in the world, abortion. We would oppose abortion. The question becomes theologically, what is the right reaction to that? I mean, seriously, right? This has probably been 30, 40 years ago, right? But there was a wave of people, not a wave of people, but there were people 30, 40 years ago that were blowing up abortion clinics, right? So we could ask the question on one hand, is the end of an abortion clinic a terrible thing? No. The end of abortion would be a good thing. But we have to ask the question, is it a Christian mandate? Is God someday going to say to me, why didn't you blow up the local...
Well, what about birth control?
Oh, well, what about birth control? Where do you want to go on birth control?
Is that, God said, populate the earth. Is it ungodly for us to take birth control?
I don't know.
How many?
I could find people. Say what?
How many babies has birth control?
Well,
Probably way more than abortion.
Well, I think part of the question there has to be how many did it prevent, and I don't know. But you also have to ask this question then, Dave, all right? And I don't know that I'm going to lobby for that one way or the other, but, right, if I don't think there should be any artificial barrier, whether it be contraception before conception or abortion, right, to prevent the life of a baby, then should there be any medical treatment available to spare the life of the baby? Right? Because what we're doing now is we're just throwing the whole thing kind of back and going, right? Babies come, babies come. Yes, and I don't think China's made it, well, actually, they've really, in recent days, they've altered that position. Now I think you can have 2 by government mandate. But you can't tie that to Christianity because China is communist and they're officially atheistic. So, yeah, I know. Well, we're just, I'm going to make my last point here to whatever extent it is. All right? So here's the consistency issue. Right? Again, I'm not trying to answer some of the existential questions that Dave asked. People disagree on those. Right? Even on this, for instance, right? Even on this issue, you can go to the Roman Catholic Church, right? Because they feel this, because they are staunch opponents of abortion. Right? They just resist this tooth and nail, abortion. But they go, well, you probably shouldn't get it, but if the vaccination will save many lives, then probably we should get it. So, again, I'm not trying to answer the question. I'm just saying, as pastor, if I'm going to oppose this vaccination because it is affiliated with abortion, then I would have to oppose anything that uses that technology. And not all of those uses are medicinal, folks. There are actually testing flavors, food flavors, beverage flavors. Some companies use this cell line technology. Let me give you another website. I'm going to give it to you very quickly here. This is called Rehumanize, INTL, rehumanize.international.org/post/fetal cells in the cosmetics, food, and medical industries. They call these cell lines tireless test tasters. Tireless test tasters. Some anti-aging products are used developing cell line technology, and if I'm opposed to them, I just think I have to be opposed to all of them. And I think if I'm going to be opposed to the technology, that I would have to carry that opposition out into the future. That not only would I refuse a COVID vaccination, I would refuse any future medical treatments that are developed on that basis. So, right, these things get very complicated and very sticky. Okay? They just do. If it's biblically wrong to, through human means, limit the amount of children that are born, and I'm not talking about abortion, which is biblically murder. Is it biblically wrong to try and preserve the life of a child through medical intervention? If my position with reference to conception is it's all in the Lord's hands, should not my position with reference to longevity be it's all in the Lord's hands? And again, I'm not trying to answer the question. I'm saying these issues tend to be a lot larger than just should I, shouldn't I. I also think, by the way, going back to this association, that if we're going to make it with reference to vaccinations, we owe it to ourselves to do the same kind of association tests to a whole litany of other things that we do and interact with as believers. Our use of the media, where we shop, the places that we shop, things like the getting of a tattoo. Somebody says, "I'm going to get a tattoo." I just heard this anywhere. One of the most popular tattoos to get in America is a cross. So if I stood in the pulpit and tried to make the connection, you shouldn't get a tattoo because of its historic associations, the general response among many people is, stop living as a caveman. But we come to this issue, and we are very clear about the problem with those associations. That's the only point I'm trying to make. They tend to be a little bit larger than all of these kinds of things. Right? So what we want to remember, folks, again, I'm talking pastorally, is that God is unchangeable and God doesn't move, and where He stands is where He stands. And with some small degree, I am allowed to stand where He doesn't stand as long as I acknowledge I know where He stands and I'm trying to do this with reference to my conscience for his glory. That's the gist of Romans 14. What I'm never allowed to do, folks, is take my stand and say that God is here unless I can clearly articulate that we're on the same place. And I was going to get into this, and now it's already 11 o'clock, and we're just going to be late. That's just all there is to it. But I do want to make mention of this, and certainly this was not anywhere on the scale of what you are contending with. But when I became a pastor in 1984, one of the things that pastors were wrestling through, new pastors were wrestling through in that day, was whether or not to participate in Social Security. Because we had the opportunity to make a sincerely held religious objection to Social Security. And I was one of the, we were just all over the map, and I don't mean that in a bad way. We were trying to think through that in a variety of issues. What's the objection to Social Security really? Well, it treats me like an employee and I'm not an employee. That was what some guys were arguing. And it's reliance upon government's assistance, and that's what other guys. And we would go to conferences, and there would be workshops on whether or not we should participate in Social Security or whether we shouldn't participate in Social Security. I opted to get out, but now, 40 years later, I'm not sure that it wasn't primarily a financial decision. The resources, it just saved me a ton of money at the time. So I'm not saying these are easy decisions. I'm saying that, right, and we're going to kind of touch on this in the morning service. I'm saying they require hard biblical work, and they require serious prayer and discussion among marriage partners of understanding what the most honorable position before the Lord is, right? So that we can look the Lord in the eye and go, we really wanted to do this because we thought you had your mind. You don't want to be in the position of having the truth be, I just don't want to do it. And then we tried to argue something that we didn't really believe about the Lord. Okay, I'm happy to talk to you privately. It's already 2 minutes after 11, so sorry about that. We'll be back as fast as we can.